He didn't know her name, just that her blood was soaking the scrub grass, and if he rode away now, the vultures would have the final word. The wind had shifted that morning, dry and acrid, smelling of scorched earth and distant gunpowder. Caleb Shaw, a solitary rancher past his prime, had been tracking a stray mare near the northern ridge of his modest New Mexico spread. The land was harsh, unyielding, like the man himself. Silence here had weight, and yet something had cracked it. A sound, thin, barely audible, like wind passing through a torn reed. He crested a low rise and saw her. A girl, Apache, no more than 18, crumpled beneath a spiny ocotillo, one leg twisted, blood seeping from a gunshot wound. Her chest rose and fell in a shallow rhythm. One arm stretched limply toward a silver chain tangled in the grass, its pendant a small stamped eagle, broken at the wing. He froze in the saddle. It was none of his business. He'd learned that the hard way. Years ago, stepping into someone else's fight had cost him the only thing he'd ever loved. Still, he dismounted. She groaned, barely conscious, eyes fluttering open just enough for him to see the sheer panic there. One brown iris ringed with red. Dust clung to her lips. He knelt. "You alone?" No answer. Her hand gripped the grass again, weak but desperate. Caleb's jaw tightened. He glanced back at the horizon. No one in sight, yet the hoof prints behind her were deep and fresh. Someone had chased her hard. He sighed, deep, low. The kind of sound a man makes when the past circles back with claws out. Gently, he slipped his arms beneath her. She was feather light, bones and sinew, and heat. A fever clung to her like a second skin. As he lifted her into the saddle, something metallic brushed against his wrist. The broken pendant. He tucked it into his coat pocket. The ride back to his cabin was slow. He took a longer route, circling behind the mesa to avoid the ridgelines. Something in his gut twisted. This wasn't just a wounded traveler. This was trouble. Living, bleeding trouble. By the time they reached the cabin, dusk was beginning its slow descent. The sky flared orange behind the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, casting long shadows over the scrub. Inside, he laid her on the old bed, once his sister's. The same bed no one had touched since the day he buried her. He stoked the fire, boiled water, and tore clean strips from an old flour sack. As he peeled the boot from the girl's injured leg, she winced and whispered something in Apache. He didn't understand, but the tone was clear. Pain, fear, confusion. He worked silently. No questions. Just hands. Steady, practiced. Years of tending livestock taught him how to clean wounds, stop bleeding. But this was different. When he unwrapped the makeshift bandage on her thigh, his breath caught. The bullet hadn't exited. Infection had already started. He'd need to dig it out, she moaned as he pressed a damp cloth to her lips. Her eyes opened again, catching his, and in them he saw something that made his stomach drop. The same terrified, uncomprehending stare his sister had given him all those years ago as the soldiers dragged her away, and he'd stood frozen. He swallowed hard. This time would be different. As he reached for the knife he'd sterilized over the fire, a gust of wind rattled the shutter. Outside, the coyotes were quiet. Too quiet. Caleb paused. Somewhere beyond the hills, the past was riding fast. And it wasn't alone. Once you take in someone running from death, his old man used to say, you'd best be ready to finish what they started, or die with them. Caleb glanced back at the girl, unconscious now, lips murmuring in some ancient prayer. He didn't know what storm was coming, but he knew he wasn't riding away this time. Night wrapped the hills in silence. Inside the cabin, shadows from the fire flickered across the walls like memories refusing to sleep. Caleb sat beside the girl, her body curled beneath a wool blanket, skin slick with fever. Every now and then she stirred, whispering in Apache, words he didn't know but felt, somehow, in his chest. The kind you didn't need translation for. Grief, fear, longing. He dipped a rag into the basin, wrung it out, and pressed it to her forehead. The room still smelled of antiseptic whiskey and blood. His hands, rough from reins and rope, moved with unexpected gentleness. He checked the bandage on her thigh, tightened it carefully. The bullet was out, but the wound would take time. And time wasn't a gift men like him often got. The girl, Ayanna, he'd learned from a half-whispered plea during her fever, was barely more than a wisp of a person. Yet somehow, her presence filled the cabin like a song he hadn't heard in years. She flinched in her sleep, murmuring something low. Caleb leaned closer, catching only fragments. Sha, Du, Chidi. A curse? A prayer? Both. He sat back, staring into the fire. It had been 12 years since a voice that soft had filled this room. Back when his sister Liza still braided flowers into her hair and sang to the chickens out back. Before that spring when cavalrymen came looking for insurgents and found excuses instead. He hadn't stopped them. He told himself it was because he was outnumbered, that he would have died and it wouldn't have helped her. But deep down he knew better. He'd been afraid. Now a stranger lay in that same bed, same age, same look in her eyes, same unspoken plea. Don't leave me. Outside, a branch cracked. Caleb stiffened, hand to knife. Then, nothing. Just a breeze toying with dry pine. He exhaled slowly. He moved to the old chest by the foot of the bed, opened it. The hinges groaned. Inside were scraps of another life, blankets with Apache stitching, a cracked photograph of Liza, and something else. A necklace, silver, tarnished, with an eagle etched in the center. He picked it up, and something inside him pulled tight. He looked at Ayanna, then at the broken pendant he'd found near her. Same pattern, same eagle, but hers was cracked at the wing. He didn't believe in signs. Never had. But the weight in his chest said otherwise. He put the necklace back and closed the chest. Ayanna stirred again. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy, unfocused, but alive. He poured her a bit of water, helped her drink. She whispered, barely audible, "Why? Help?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stood, moved to the table, and removed the revolver from his belt. He set it down with a soft thud. Ayanna's gaze followed the motion, then fell shut again. No more questions. Not tonight. But as Caleb looked down at his hands, scarred, sun-browned, shaking slightly, he realized he hadn't felt this alive in years. Not since Liza. Some things you bury don't stay buried. And some debts come knocking in the voice of a girl who shouldn't be alive. As he doused the lamp and settled into the old rocking chair, he caught a glimpse through the window. Hoof prints, barely visible under moonlight, circling back. They were being hunted. Who was chasing her, he thought. And what did they think she'd seen? He gripped the armrest tighter. This wasn't over, not by a damn long shot. Before we dive into everything, let us know in the comments. Where are you watching this video from? Connecting with viewers from all across the world has been a huge source of inspiration for us. Morning brought no comfort. The sun rose pale and sluggish behind a bank of dusty clouds, casting the desert in a strange, bruised light. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low. Caleb sat in silence, a rifle laid across his knees, eyes darting to the window every few moments. Ayanna stirred behind him, groaning softly. Her fever had broken sometime before dawn, but she was still weak. Her words slurred, her thoughts scattered. When he brought her water, she tried to speak. "They're close," she murmured. "I figured," Caleb said, voice low. Outside, the wind was wrong again, restless, shifting directions like a predator trying to mask its scent. He stepped out for a moment, boots crunching gravel. No bird song, no coyotes, only the dry hiss of the wind in the brush. But there it was, barely visible, curling above the far ridgeline. Smoke. Someone had made camp. Not more than a few miles out. He squinted. The earth bore fresh marks, hoof prints circling wide, like a noose tightening. They were being watched. Back inside, he knelt beside Ayanna. "You sure they're not your people?" Her eyes snapped open, sudden clarity replacing the fever haze. "No," she rasped. "Soldiers. From Fort Arwood. They're not looking to take me back. They want silence." Caleb's jaw clenched. He recognized the name. Fort Arwood had once been under the command of Colonel Reeve, an honorable man, now dead, replaced by someone else, someone willing to break pacts and spill blood for land. "What did you see?" he asked. Ayanna hesitated. Then, with a trembling hand, she reached into her dress and pulled out a folded scrap of oilskin. Inside, carefully wrapped, a military tag, its number half filed away, and a piece of paper, worn and smudged, but legible. A field order, signed with Kane's name. Operation Dustfire, clean sweep of disputed territory under pretense of pacification. No survivors, no witnesses. Caleb read it twice. Then again, his throat dried. Kane. The same Kane who once dragged him from a mud pit outside San Marcos, saved his life in a gunfight near Laredo. The same man who now ordered a massacre and would kill to cover it. Ayanna's voice pulled him back. "They killed the old ones first, then burned the grain. I ran. I wasn't supposed to get out." Caleb stared at the fire, the flames dancing like ghosts. He said nothing. Outside, a bird screeched, sharp, unnatural. Caleb moved fast. He stepped out with his rifle and scanned the horizon. There, on the ridge, a glint of metal. Then it vanished. They weren't just watching, they were checking his defenses. He returned inside, shut the door with care. "Can you ride?" he asked. Ayanna shook her head. "Not far, not fast. Then we're staying." He went to the barn, checked his tools. Hammer, nails, barbed wire. He'd need to reinforce the shutters, trap the rear trail, bury supplies. Back in the cabin, Ayanna tried to sit up. "You don't have to—" He cut her off. "I know." A pause. Then she said, "Why are you?" He didn't answer, just handed her a tin cup and walked out again. Behind the cabin, he knelt near the base of the old cottonwood. There, long buried, was a rusted chest. He dug it up with his hands. Inside, a pouch of blasting caps, a tin of black powder, and 3 sticks of dynamite, relics from the old days. He tested each fuse, nodding to himself. Sometimes silence wasn't peace. Sometimes it was just the pause before the storm. And Caleb Shaw, long since done with heroes and causes, was preparing for a siege. The night came down heavy and still. No stars, just the hush of a world holding its breath. Caleb stood watch beside the window, the rifle steady in his grip. Inside, Ayanna sat propped up against a stack of folded blankets, her face pale but eyes sharp now, sharper than before. She had asked for time to gather her thoughts, to remember what mattered. Now she was ready. "I didn't run just because I was scared," she said, her voice clearer. "I ran because I had to tell someone." Caleb turned from the window. She held up the field order again, creased, smudged, but undeniable. "This isn't just a raid, it's a cover-up. Kane and his men are stealing land from my people, land marked by treaty, land they found gold beneath." Caleb took the paper and studied it under the lantern. Every word burned deeper, the more he read. "Execute without delay. Civilians to be processed as hostile insurgents. No records, no graves." The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Kane Holt. "I worked at the fort," Ayanna continued. "Interpreter, liaison. My uncle. He served in the Union Army. Thought that would matter. He trusted them." Her voice wavered. "They asked me to translate a false report. Said it was just to secure the perimeter." She shook her head, bitter. "But it was a kill order, signed and ready, for an entire village. My people." Caleb's fists tightened around the paper. He had fought beside Cain, shared firelight and whiskey, trusted him. "I stole this after I heard them talking about the mine," she said. "They don't just want the land. They want it gone. No Apache. No claims. Just gold." She leaned forward, suddenly intense. "They won't stop, Caleb. Not unless someone speaks out. That's why I have to make it to Ayana Ridge." He frowned. "What's at the ridge?" "My uncle. And others. Witnesses. People who'll stand up. If I can get there, they'll listen." Outside, a branch snapped. Caleb moved quickly, peering through the shutter. Nothing, but he could feel it. Eyes in the dark. "They're not waiting anymore," he muttered. "We've got till dawn if we're lucky." He turned to her. "That's why they want you dead, not captured, dead. You're the loose thread." She nodded. "Why'd you come this way?" he asked. "I didn't mean to," she said. "My horse was shot. I ran west through the canyons. Thought I was done for." She looked at him then, long and hard. "And then you found me." He stared back, silent. Something in him shifted, not just rage, not just duty, something deeper, a fire rekindled in the ashes of old guilt. He crossed to the table, unfolded an old map. "There's a trail runs north through Copper Pass, quiet, narrow, but risky." She looked at him with renewed hope. "You'll take me?" "No," he said, drawing a line with his finger. "I'll get you there. You'll ride. I'll deal with Cain." Ayana blinked, but he cut her off. "No one else is going to stop him." She hesitated, then reached into her satchel. "There's something else," she said softly. She pulled out a bundle wrapped in leather. Inside, a photograph, a group of Union soldiers, standing tall. One of them, young, proud, was Caleb himself. She pointed to the man beside him. "That's my uncle, James Two Rivers. You served together." Caleb stared at the photo. He remembered that face, the calm in the chaos. The man who once pulled him from gunfire during the Shenandoah push. "I didn't know," he whispered. "He said if I ever found you, to tell you the debt was never forgotten." The words hit like a hammer. Caleb sat down slow, the weight of it all pressing into his spine. He looked back at the window. The darkness seemed to move. Cain hadn't just betrayed his oath. He had made war on the very ground they'd once bled for. And now it was his move. The knock came at dawn. Not a polite rap, not even a warning. It was the flat, heavy thud of a rifle butt against wood, repeated, insistent, like a war drum in slow rhythm. Caleb stood from the table, slid the rifle into his hand. He didn't look at Ayana, didn't have to. She was already pulling herself toward the back of the cabin, behind the partition they'd built the night before. He stepped to the door, cracked it open. Cain Holt stood outside. Dusty boots, regulation coat, silver badge gleaming in the pale morning light. Behind him, 3 mounted men waited, rifles across their laps, horses snorting in the rising heat. All wore military colors, except their faces held the blank, hired look of men paid not to ask questions. "Caleb," Cain said, voice low, as if greeting an old friend at a graveside. "You're a long way from Fort Arwood," Caleb replied, stepping out, letting the door fall closed behind him. Cain smirked. "Word was you had a stray run onto your land. An Apache girl, armed, dangerous, possible saboteur." Caleb shrugged. "Didn't see anyone." "That's so." Cain stepped closer. "Funny, 'cause we tracked her blood trail past the mesa, faded out just a half-mile west of here. I run cattle. Lot of blood on this land." Cain's face hardened. "Don't play dumb, Shaw. I know you. You might have hung up your star, but I remember the fire in your gut." He leaned in. "But I also remember you knew when to walk away." Caleb didn't blink. "What's she got that scares you, Cain?" The question landed like a slap. Cain straightened. "This isn't about fear. It's about order. That girl, she's part of a group trying to stir rebellion, claiming treaties, land rights, old ghost stories. You know how dangerous that gets." Caleb said nothing. Cain's eyes narrowed. "You're not just harboring a fugitive, you're obstructing justice, and that makes you a traitor." He motioned to his men. 2 of them dismounted and began circling toward the rear of the cabin. Inside, Ayana crouched low, her eyes wide. She clutched the satchel with the field order and photo tight against her chest. Back outside, Caleb took a step forward. "Call them off, Cain." Cain's mouth twitched. "Make me." The tension broke like dry wood. Caleb swung the rifle up, not to fire, but to signal. A blast cracked from behind the barn, a concussive, deafening boom. as one of the tripwires he'd set exploded, sending dirt and debris into the air. Horses reared, shouts rang out. The two soldiers fell back in panic. In the chaos, Caleb slammed Cain back against the porch post, pressing the rifle barrel to his chest. "This is your only warning," Caleb growled. "You set foot on my land again, I don't just wound." Cain's eyes flared with hatred. "You think you're the law now. I think the law died the day you started killing kids for gold." Cain shoved him off, spit blood into the dirt, then called to his men. "Fall back!" They regrouped at the ridge, glaring. Cain mounted his horse but didn't ride away. Instead, he pointed. "You've made your choice, Shaw. You want to die with her? Fine. We'll be back with warrants, firepower, and no more warnings." He turned his horse and rode off. The others followed. Silence returned, but it was brittle, charged with the promise of return. Caleb went back inside. Ayanna was standing now, though barely. Her hands trembled. "They'll burn this place," she whispered. Caleb nodded. "That's what men do when the truth scares them." She looked at him. "So, what now?" He opened the cabinet and pulled out an old military coat, stained, patched. He slipped it on slowly, like stepping back into a former self. "Now," he said, loading the rifle, "we finish what they started." That night, the wind carried the scent of rain that never came. Caleb sat on the porch steps, his rifle across his knees, the stars like frost overhead. He hadn't lit the lantern. He didn't need light to remember. Inside, Ayanna slept fitfully, the pain in her leg keeping her half awake. But she no longer whimpered. She no longer feared him, and that somehow made the silence deeper. He opened the old cigar tin in his hand. Inside was a photograph, faded and curled at the edges. Liza. She wore a white dress, her smile tilted like she didn't quite believe in happiness. Behind her, the church bell tower of Dust Creek, before the soldiers came, before they accused her of harboring hostile sympathizers, before they dragged her out. And Caleb, 20, frozen, terrified, had stood motionless, holding nothing but a locket she dropped in the dirt. He had never forgiven himself. Not because he couldn't save her, but because he hadn't tried. That moment had lived behind every scar he'd earned, every silence he'd kept. Now another girl was bleeding into the same dirt, and this time his hands were steady. The door creaked. Ayanna stood there, barefoot, wrapped in a blanket. Her face was drawn, her eyes luminous in the dark. "You don't sleep," she said. "Not much," he replied. She stepped forward. "Was it her?" Caleb looked down, then he nodded once. "I was just a kid," he said, scared. "Thought keeping my head down would save us both." Ayanna sat beside him, but it didn't. No. They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that doesn't need filling. "I'm sorry," she said. Caleb almost laughed, soft and bitter. "You didn't do it." "I meant, I'm sorry no one stopped them. Then or now." He nodded slowly. "That's the curse, isn't it? The silence." She looked out toward the hills. "They'll come again tomorrow." "Before sunup," he agreed. She turned to him. "You could leave." "I know." "You should." He met her gaze. "You could leave. I've got 2 horses ready. You could ride for the ridge." "And leave you behind." He didn't answer. She shook her head. "You think this is redemption, but I don't need a martyr." Caleb's voice was quiet, certain. "It's not about redemption. It's about finally doing the thing I should have done all those years ago. Stand between them and the innocent, with a gun if I have to." She was quiet. Then she whispered, "You won't make it." He shrugged. That was never part of the bargain. She reached into her satchel again and pulled out something wrapped in deerskin. When she unwrapped it, he saw what lay inside, a carved bone whistle, worn smooth from use. She pressed it into his hand. "If I fall," she said, "blow this. My people will hear. We're not as far as they think." He took it, feeling the weight of more than just bone. "What's it mean?" She smiled weakly. "It means the wind is turning, and it won't blow in Cain's favor forever." Caleb tucked it into his pocket. They sat for a while longer, watching the horizon. He finally said, "Tomorrow, we move." "Where?" "To where they can't chase you. And if they do," he tapped the rifle, "they'll wish they hadn't." Ayanna hesitated, then quietly, "Thank you." "Da, Shiaj." Caleb turned. That means... My uncle used to say it. My father's heart. Doesn't mean blood. Means someone who carried you through the storm. He looked away. The stars above burned like silent prayers. When they rose at dawn, the rifles were ready. And so were they. The cabin was quiet in the hours before dawn. Too quiet. Caleb moved like a shadow through the room, checking supplies, counting cartridges, tightening the straps on Ayanna's saddle. Every movement was measured, practiced, but his breath was slower now, heavier, not from fear, but finality. Outside, the night air hung thick with stillness. Even the crickets had gone silent. Ayanna stood by the door, wrapped in a borrowed coat, her eyes scanning the darkness. "You believe in signs?" she asked. Caleb didn't look up. "I believe in horses that don't spook without reason." She walked to the window. "Back home, we say if the owls fly low before dawn, the dead are stirring." Caleb gave a dry chuckle. "Then this whole desert's haunted." Ayanna didn't smile. He paused, set down the lantern. "You scared?" She nodded, "but not of dying." He raised an eyebrow. "I'm scared no one will remember why I ran, why I spoke out, that the land will just forget." Caleb crossed the room and handed her the satchel. Inside it was everything that mattered. Proof, the photograph, the order. "They won't," he said simply. Ayanna's hands trembled as she took it. "You sure this will work?" "No." "Then why?" "Because I'd rather fall standing beside you than live knowing I let you go alone." She looked away quickly, blinking back something that stung. "I never asked," she said softly. "But why me? Why now?" He shrugged. "Because once I watched someone I loved get dragged away. And I did nothing." Ayanna said nothing. She just placed a hand on his arm. It was the first time either of them had touched. The wind shifted. A faint metallic clink echoed from the ridge. Caleb's head snapped toward the sound. "They're staging." "How many?" "Hard to say. Enough." Ayanna exhaled. "Then we move before dawn." He nodded. She limped to the table, picked up a small pouch of herbs she'd prepared. "If you get hit, pack this. Slows the bleeding." He took it with a smirk. "You planning on letting me get hit?" She looked at him, dead serious. "You better not." He strapped it to his belt. Then he moved to the window, glanced out at the faint silhouette of the distant ridge. The world was holding its breath. Behind him, Ayanna whispered something in Apache, a short phrase, musical and low. He turned. "What was that?" "A prayer." "For us?" She shook her head. "For the land. So it won't hold our blood too long." A heavy silence fell. Then Caleb said, "Come here." She stepped closer. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out the silver necklace, the one from his chest, the eagle etched deep into its face. He placed it in her hand. "My sister's," he said. "She'd want you to have it." Ayanna stared at it, then back at him. "This is protection," he said. "Or at least, remembrance." She closed her fingers around it. "I'll carry her with me." They walked outside together. The horses were saddled. The trail north waited like a thin line through a canyon of fate. Caleb gave her one last look. "This is where we split." She opened her mouth to argue, but he raised a hand. "Just until you're past Copper Ridge. I'll draw them off. If you hear thunder, keep going." She nodded, swallowing hard. "Caleb." He smiled, small, sad. "Don't say goodbye." Then he stepped onto his horse and vanished into the night. Behind him, the desert stirred. The storm was near. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. Dawn was still hours away, but the world had begun to glow with a pre-storm pale light. Caleb rode fast along the ridge trail, boots planted firmly in the stirrups. His wound throbbed, but adrenaline drowned out the pain. Every breath tasted like iron and promises unkept. At the brink of a deep wash, he spotted Cain's men setting camp by a fallen juniper. Ayanna's silhouette was gone. She was past Copper Ridge, where the canyon walls began to close in. She'd escape. Now the rest was up to Caleb. He slid from his horse, tying reins to a low branch. He crept forward, rifle thick in his grip, heart snarling like a caged hawk. This was no mere confrontation. It was everything. Cain stood at the edge of the clearing, barking orders at his 3 soldiers who crouched behind rocks. They spotted movement, the promise of disturbance. Then Caleb appeared, silhouette against pre-dawn gloom. Cain tensed, hand darting for his pistol. "Shaw!" he spat. "I warned you." Caleb didn't answer. He raised the rifle and fired at the wooden support of their makeshift barricade. Splinters flew as dust bloomed. Horses snorted. Guys ducked. The world erupted in chaos. Before they knew it, Caleb sprinted forward, hurling a homemade incendiary, one of the crude bombs from the barn, into the camp's center. A sudden whoosh, and then a burst. Flame shot skyward, wood and canvas igniting. Cain's men scattered, panic on their faces. Cain charged close, pistol drawn. "You insane!" Caleb met him, tipping on unsteady feet. Blood smeared his cheek. He swung the rifle like a club. It clanged against Cain's gun hand, disarming him. The pistol flew and skittered across the rocks. But Cain was not young. He grinned skull-thin, baring teeth. He pressed a knee into Caleb's chest, wrestled control of the rifle. Yet even as arguments flared between them, sweat, dirt, rage, a single word roared in Caleb's head. No more hiding. He kicked out, breaking free. Cain lunged at him. Caleb sidestepped, drawing pistol too. His last oldest Colt slides smooth, even in trembling fingers. He fired a warning shot into the air, then another at the ground at Cain's feet. Cain faltered. "That's how it ends, Shaw." Caleb didn't flinch. "Yeah, that's how it ends." Cain's men formed a weak line behind him. They had weapons, but no conviction. Musket barrels trembled. Cain barked orders, but his voice cracked with the fire's hiss and the threat in Caleb's tone. Ariana's bone whistle, quiet at first, cut through the tension, a single mournful note, then another and another. It carried across the stones, weaving through the camp like a breath from the past. Cain froze. Caleb looked east, eyes narrowing. Then the sound of hoofbeats, distant but growing, hundreds strong. He let Cain stare for a moment. "You lost, Holt." Cain spat. "You think this makes you right?" Caleb's fist tightened. "I don't need you to think that." The cavalry-like thundering grew louder. Dawn's gray veil parted, revealing silken shapes on horseback. Apache warriors rushing the wash, rifles at rest but eyes burning with purpose. Caleb stepped back, never taking his eyes off Cain. He raised his voice. "This is what happens when you shoot first and ask questions later." Cain's men looked between Caleb and the world breaking in on them. Their faces drained. They dropped to the ground, weapons lowered. Caleb walked toward Cain. The smell of burning wood and sweat choked the air. He reached Cain, planted the barrel of the rifle at his chest. "Any man here will vouch for what I did," he said. "Any man who lets me live." Silence. Cain's gaze flicked to the Apache riders, still a mile distant, forming ranks, but their horses pawed the air, ready. Finally, Cain sagged. He opened his mouth, but what came out was a hoarse whisper. "You intend to give me up?" Caleb looked skyward. The cavalry of dust, leather, and feathers roared nearer. He knelt and pulled Cain's pistol from the dirt. "No," he answered. "I intend to let the land deal with you." He jammed the pistol into Cain's belt and turned away. Behind him, the Apache riders halted, forming a silent wall of horse and determination at the canyon's mouth. The time for talk was over. At first, it was only a low rumble. Then the land itself seemed to rise. From every ridge and hollow, they came. Apache warriors mounted on dark-coated horses, faces painted in ritual patterns, feathers catching the new light of dawn. The thunder of their approach was not wild, but measured, like a heartbeat grown mighty. They rode not as marauders, but as memory come alive, elders and sons, scouts and medicine men, women riding beside brothers in silence, broken only by hoof and wind. Cain turned, disbelief etched into his features. "What the hell is this?" No one answered. From the center of the formation rode a tall man wrapped in a faded blue Union coat, the silver buttons glinting, worn from time and grief. His face was weathered bronze, his braids streaked with gray. His name was James Two Rivers, and he had once fought under the same flag as Caleb Shaw. At his side rode a black horse like oil in motion, and upon it the old medicine man, the Thymo-Gia, his eyes veiled beneath the shadow of an elk-bone headdress. In his hand he held a long staff tipped with raven feathers and a strip of torn military ribbon. It fluttered like a warning. The riders stopped in a half circle around Caleb and Cain, enclosing them in quiet judgment. Cain tried to step back, but the ground behind him cracked under his boot. No escape. James dismounted slowly. He spoke to Caleb first. "You held the line." Caleb gave a weary nod. "Didn't know who else would." James turned to his niece, who had now limped from her cover, standing tall despite her pain. His voice softened. "You kept the promise." She bowed her head. "You taught me how." The old man on the black horse finally moved. He raised his staff, and the entire assembly fell into silence. No hoof shifted, no bird dared cry. The Thymo spoke. His voice was gravel and wind and thunder beneath a canyon wall. "You," he pointed the staff at Cain, "brought fire to the roots and poison to the well. You wrote your name with ash." Cain laughed bitterly, eyes darting for allies that were no longer loyal. "I have done nothing but uphold federal law." "Lies!" The old man cut through him like a knife through parchment. "You stand accused not by courts, but by the spirits of those you tried to erase. You came to our land with gold in your eyes and death in your mouth. And now the land will speak." He turned to the warriors and made a sharp gesture. From one of the saddlebags, a small deer-hide bundle was brought forward. Inside it lay a handful of soil, dark and rich. "This is the land you claimed," said the Thymo. "She does not know you. She does not remember your footsteps, nor your name. You will not return to her." Cain paled. James stepped forward and pulled the badge from Cain's chest. "This gave you the power to kill without consequence. Not anymore." He cast it to the ground. Ayanna reached into her satchel and held up the document. The false field order. She gave it to the medicine man without a word. The Thymo opened it and read in silence. Then in one swift motion, he held it to a flame drawn from a smoldering brand. The fire curled the paper, and with it, the last justification of Cain Holt. "This is not exile," he said. "This is erasure." Cain struggled as two warriors grabbed his arms. "You can't, this isn't." But his words were swallowed by the chanting that began around them. Not loud, not cruel. A dirge. A mourning not for Cain, but for what he had broken. The Thymo raised his voice once more. "No stone will mark him. No tongue will carry his name. The land will not keep his bones. He will walk forgotten." Cain fought, but there was nowhere to run. They stripped his military coat, tore the insignia from it, and bound his hands not with rope, but with the ceremonial cloth of disgrace, white, unmarked, unwoven, the fabric of absence. Then they led him away, and the sun broke over the ridge, casting long shadows of warriors who remembered everything. Cain Holt no longer walked with command in his step. He stumbled between two Apache scouts, wrists bound, face bruised from a fall that no one offered to break. His uniform hung from him in tatters, stripped of medals, rank, and all illusion of dignity. The march was slow, deliberate. Caleb watched in silence as they led him toward the ceremonial fire circle the tribe had prepared just beyond the wash. The flames were not large, but they burned with purpose. Ayanna stood with her Uncle James, holding the now charred remains of the false orders in one hand and the photograph of Caleb's sister in the other. When Caleb approached, she handed him the photo without a word. He took it, looking long at the face he hadn't let himself remember until now. James spoke, voice clear, cutting across the gathered witnesses, Apache, townsfolk, even a few cavalrymen who had followed the stir and arrived too late to cover for Cain. This man, James said, stood to gain from blood. Not just Apache blood, but yours too. He looked to the officers behind. He'd have sold you a war, made heroes of murderers, and left you to carry the shame. The younger lieutenant, barely past 20, looked down ashamed. James continued, but this land remembers, and those who walk it truthfully, like Caleb Shaw, have called that memory forward. Caleb stepped up beside James, his coat streaked with ash and blood. He held the photograph aloft. This girl, he said, voice thick but steady, was named Liza. She died screaming for help I didn't give. I spent 15 years trying to forget that day. He turned toward Ayanna, but this one didn't let me forget. She reminded me that silence helps the killers, and standing between them and the innocent, that's the only thing worth doing anymore. Ayanna's eyes shimmered, but she didn't speak. The Thamo stepped into the center, holding aloft a clay bowl. Inside, it contained soil from their sacred land. Earth Cain had sought to steal and defile. He turned it slowly in his hands, then poured it onto a flat stone. To be remembered, the old man said, is to be kept by the land. He turned to Cain. But you are to be forgotten. Then he raised the ceremonial staff. In the name of the ancestors and the blood that sings in this soil, we cast you out. You will not be spoken of. No marker will carry your name. You are not welcome in the ground, nor in memory. Cain's lips parted, perhaps for protest, perhaps for pleading, but no sound came. The warriors turned him eastward toward the edge of the old trails, where no tribes claimed the land and no shelter waited. He would walk until his strength failed, and when it did, no hand would reach for him. Caleb watched him go, not with triumph, but with gravity. Ayanna stepped beside him. It's done. No, he murmured. It's beginning. Behind them, the tribal warriors raised a low chant, one of cleansing, not vengeance. A song to honor the land, to close the wound. And the morning wind carried it gently across the mesas. The desert does not forget, but it does choose what to remember. Cain Holt walked alone now, stripped of weapons, badge, and name. His boots scraped the stone, stirring dust that refused to cling to him. The bindings around his wrists had been cut, not out of mercy, but because no Apache warrior would waste a knot on a man who would no longer exist. He looked back once. No one stood behind him. The watchers had turned their backs as he crossed the boundary stones, silent markers that divided memory from oblivion. Past this point, he belonged not to tribe or army, not to the land or even history. He belonged to erasure. The sky above offered no shade. The sun rose like judgment itself, burning away footprints before they could be followed. Miles behind, the medicine man stood on the ridge. His staff was planted in the earth, feathers rustling like breath. His voice rose, slow and even, echoing across the basin. He is cast out not to die, but to vanish. May no coyote find his bones. May no tree whisper his name. May no mother warn her child of him, for to warn is to remember. The tribe repeated the final line. To warn is to remember. Cain stumbled forward. Every sound, the rustle of grass, the hiss of wind, seemed to reject him. The insects did not land on his skin. The stones rolled away beneath his boots. He tried to call out once. some guttural plea, but even his voice cracked like a dry branch and was lost. He had thought banishment would be exile. Instead, it was silence. Back at the encampment, Caleb stood beside Ayanna and her uncle James. The finality of it pressed into his chest. Not vengeance, not satisfaction, but stillness. A kind of grave peace. James placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. He walks the path of shadows now. Let the earth take care of the rest. Caleb nodded. And us. You. The old man smiled faintly. You stay. We don't erase the ones who stood between harm and the innocent. Ayanna approached. In her hand was the silver necklace, Liza's. She extended it back toward him, but Caleb shook his head. Number you carry that now. Her brow furrowed. But it's not mine. It is, he said, voice low, because you made me remember who I was when I wore it. You gave me back my name. She blinked quickly, then slipped the necklace around her neck. The chant of release ended. The Thamo turned and raised the bowl of ash high. He scattered it to the wind. Let the land reclaim what was nearly stolen. Let it bloom where blood no longer falls. And far to the east, the figure of Cain Holt disappeared over the ridge, swallowed not by death, but by forgetting. The air had changed, not just in the way it moved, gentler now like a sigh, but in what it carried. The scent of burned canvas and gunpowder had given way to creosote and wild sage, the kind of smell Caleb remembered from long ago when he was still a boy, and the world still felt like something God had his hand on. The Apache had packed their camp swiftly, efficiently. No victory songs, no boasting, only quiet gestures of respect. Nods toward Caleb, touches to Ayanna's shoulder, the kind of reverence that didn't shout. It was enough. Caleb sat by the stream where they'd watered the horses. His coat was folded beside him, his shirt rolled at the sleeves, arms streaked with old scars and fresh bandages. He held the locket now, Liza's picture still inside, and turned it gently in his hand. He didn't weep. Not because he didn't feel it, but because some griefs, when finally heard, become peace. Behind him, Ayanna approached with slow steps, still favoring her leg. She carried a small basket of berries and a folded cloth. They're waiting, she said softly. For me? For us. He glanced at her, then looked back at the water. You know, he said, I used to think the Lord had turned his face away from this place. After the war, after Liza, she sat beside him. I thought maybe there wasn't any grace left in the desert. Ayanna didn't interrupt. But now, he held up the locket. Now I think he was just waiting for me to stop running. A wind stirred the grass around them, brushing the tops of the yucca plants like a hand through hair. I prayed last night, Ayanna whispered. First time in a while, not just to the spirits of my people, but to him. Caleb turned. I asked for a sign that I was still seen, that what I did still mattered. He gave a soft smile. And? She looked at him. You showed up. They didn't speak for a while after that. The land didn't require it. The desert was not empty, not truly. It just waited until people learned how to listen. When they rose to return to the others, Ayanna reached into her coat and pulled out a weathered New Testament, wrapped in a faded cloth. She pressed it into Caleb's hand. My uncle carried this in the war, she said. Gideon's Bible. Said it caught a bullet once. Caleb's brows lifted. Did it save him? She nodded. Twice. He traced the leather cover with a thumb. I'll keep it close. They walked back toward the gathering together. At the edge of the trail where the horses waited, James Two Rivers stood with the medicine man. The old priest raised a hand, not a gesture of command, but of blessing. "The land remembers," he said, "but so does heaven." And the wind answered, rustling the leaves like an old hymn returned to its chorus. The sky that morning wasn't just brighter, it felt cleaner, as if the night had taken something heavy with it when it left. Caleb stood apart from the others, watching Ayanna braid a child's hair, gently showing her how to thread the strands with corn husk ties. The girl giggled, sunlight dancing on her cheeks. It was a sound Caleb hadn't heard in years, pure, weightless joy. He turned his face upward, letting the warmth spill across his worn features. The wind no longer stung. It no longer sounded like whispers from a life he'd failed to live. Now it carried something else. Possibility. For the first time in decades, Caleb had nowhere he needed to flee. No old wounds left to deny. The ache for vengeance had been buried not with a bullet, but with the dignity of a land that chose to remember what mattered and forget what did not. His hand slipped into his coat pocket and closed around the worn Bible Ayanna had given him, not because he needed comfort, but because he believed, deep down, that someone had guided his steps all along. The verse from Sunday school returned to him. "The steps of a righteous man are ordered by the Lord." He never felt righteous, but maybe being righteous wasn't the same as being perfect. Maybe it meant standing when it would be easier to turn away. Ayanna approached, brushing dust from her sleeves. "They're asking what you'll do next." Caleb smirked. "That's a hell of a question." Someone mentioned a small patch of land up north, needs a steady hand, water rights secured, good soil. He looked at her. "And?" She shrugged. "I told them you might not stay, that you still had miles left in your boots." He chuckled. "I might, but I'm tired of walking alone." She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. Side by side, they walked back toward the others, toward coffee pots and laughter, toward something that looked and felt almost impossibly like home. And behind them, the hills stood silent. Not in mourning, but in peace. Long after the fires cooled and the dust settled, the story of what happened near Copper Ridge was rarely told in full, not because it was hidden, but because the land had already told it, etched in hoofprints and ash, in stone trails no longer walked by Kane Holt, and in the gentle curve of the river where Ayanna once lay, waiting for mercy. People remembered a stranger who came down from the ridgeline, wounded but unafraid, a loner who didn't ask to be a hero, but who chose not to look away. They spoke of how the Apache rode not to wage war, but to restore balance, how their voices rose not in vengeance, but in prayer, how an old medicine man reminded everyone that justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about remembering what mattered and letting go of what did not. And somewhere among those memories, there was a whisper of grace, of a man once lost, Caleb Shaw, who found his way not by maps or signs, but by faith. A quiet, persistent kind, the kind that flickers even in desert winds and keeps burning when all else has gone dark. The land did not speak his name in thunder. It didn't need to. Instead, it offered him something rarer. Forgiveness, redemption, a place to belong, not as a soldier, not as a wanderer, but as a man who chose to stay, to tend the soil, to teach younger hands how to mend fences and pray before a shared meal. There, in the stillness of evening, by the light of a worn oil lamp, he sometimes read aloud from the old Bible, not as a preacher, just as a man grateful to be heard. And when the children asked what happened to the bad man, he would say simply, "The land forgot him." So, we could remember better things. Because sometimes what justice leaves behind is not fear, but a chance to begin again. And that was what the land remembered most. What defines a righteous man in a world where justice often rides late? Maybe it's not the uniform he wore or the enemies he fought, but the quiet decision to protect the vulnerable, to choose mercy over revenge, and to believe that even in barren places, God still plants seeds of redemption. Caleb's journey reminds us that the true Wild West stories weren't written in the noise of saloons or the chaos of gunfights. They were whispered in campfires and prayers beneath desert skies, and in the choices of men and women who stood for what was right when it cost them everything. This wasn't just a tale of bullets and badges. It was about memory and grace, and the kind of strength that kneels before it stands. And now we turn to you. What would you have done in Caleb's place? Leave your thoughts below. Just one line, one feeling, one choice. Your voice helps keep these true Wild West stories alive, passed down not in silence, but in shared memory. Because some stories deserve to be remembered, not for how they ended, but for what they made us feel.